I call this Do It Yourself Dharma. And it's a series of short blogs that are a little more direct than some of my writings. And you can always just pass it over, just ignore it. For one thing, it has a few more do this and don't do that suggestions, which is, kind of smacks of old-time religion. So it's really designed for those of you who have found already that the mind can at times be quite obscured, and it's not just naturally clear all the time. If you know this already, then you may be more willing to just get down to learning to work with the mind. So what follows here are some suggestions, and a method, a method of practice that helps you deal with emotional reactions, what the Tibetans call kleshas. The Tibetan teachings are always about pointing out how we can, and in fact we must, eventually enlighten ourselves, and that no one else can do it for us. Even the Buddha himself could not just touch our forehead and zap us into enlightenment. Because the whole idea is that sooner or later, each of us must undertake the Dharma practice necessary to become aware enough to wake up to our own true nature, to our own mind, and see how it works. So, in other words, Buddhism is not your typical religious belief system, but rather just a simple path, a practical method. It has no cosmology, it has no God, it has no beginning and no suggested end time. It's just simply a method for developing awareness, pure and simple. It's all about just waking up, period. There are many recipes, therapies, concepts, and remedies for healing ourselves mentally, and we're welcome to try them all. Some may help for a time. For myself, what I have found is that I need some kind of a practical method, not just a concept, not just an idea, but a method if I'm expected to keep at it. I need some way to do it. And Tibetan Buddhism is all about practical methods. That's all it is. That's what the Dharma is, simply the recipe for enlightenment that Buddha left for us. The proof of any treatment or any therapy turns on the likelihood of our keeping up a practice after trying it for a week or so. We all know most fad techniques kind of fall by the wayside for one good reason or another. It seems that my quote-unquote self, does not much like to practice, does not much like the rote learning of new habits, even if they're supposed to be good for me. So at times I've had to use some reverse psychology, because, my particular self can be fickle. And one concept that I like is the whole concept of no church on Sunday. I mean, there's really no church on Sunday equivalent in Buddhism. No once a week convocation, getting together for an hour at church, and that's our spiritual practice. There's nothing like that aside from, our celebrating natural events like the new and full moon or eclipses and so on. So Buddhist practice, the method, is pretty much meant to be online. I mean, in one form or another, not just on Sundays, but 24/7. The goal of learning Buddhist practice isn't just to sit in the corner for half an hour a day, but it's to integrate these meditation techniques into our life so that we're mindful all the time, not just once in a while. So don't look for a Sunday kind of 1 hour injection of Buddhism. Another point that surprised me early on is that Buddhism is not evangelical. So we're not urged to go out and teach others what we're learning. In fact, it's just the opposite. I was told, and this is standard Buddhist teaching, to work on enlightening myself first, and then perhaps down the line, I might be fit to be of use to other people. In fact, until we are relatively free and clear ourselves, we're going to mostly cause others harm by ministering unto them, as long as we have our own obscurations pretty much still intact. So work on yourself first is what they suggest. And in the lineage that I belong to, we have to be given permission directly from our teacher before we can share our knowledge with others in a formal way. And it takes time. And this is an important point. What if a student told you that they wanted to learn to play the guitar or to sing really well, and they not just dabble in it once in a while, but actually master it? Of course, you might tell them to practice some each day, when they could manage to fit it into their schedule. But we also know that 15 minutes or even half an hour a day, or even an hour, while perhaps totally really helpful, is not what it takes to be a really good player. For most of us, it would take a lot more than that. Anyone who is at all expert at anything knows this. And it's totally the same with the Dharma. The Dharma is no exception. If we have full-time problems, we need a full-time solution, just as we would if our body needed healing. We don't just apply medicine to our body once a week on Sunday. In a similar way, Dharma practice is not a sometimes thing, not a part-time job or just an option. It becomes a necessity, and we can't afford to just dabble in it. Therefore, we have to find a way to enjoy Dharma practice more of the time, and that's what this blog is about. Now, pie in the sky. Let's not idealize the Dharma overmuch. Of course, treat the Dharma with respect, but know what in the Dharma is worthy of your respect. Don't make a religious trip out of what is just rote practice, like sitting meditation. Being respectful for no reason other than for respect's sake is not honoring the Dharma, but just another way to keep it at arm's length. So don't mix the Christian or other religions' tradition of keeping God on some high altar. Don't mix that with practicing the Dharma. Dharma practice involves working with yourself right in the middle of your day-to-day situation. And your quote, self, unquote, is something that you're already familiar with. In fact, if we look, we will find that there's probably very little that we hold sacred in ourself, except perhaps not having our feelings hurt. The self hates that. Dharma practice is like making pottery. You're going to have to get your hands right down into the clay. So it's important to separate out any residual or inherited sense of, the quote-unquote holy, of religiousness. Separate that from our Dharma practice until we can acquire our own reverence from the beauty of the Dharma itself. In other words, don't mix your religious upbringing with the Dharma. The carryover is often not at all helpful. The Dharma itself is not in any way mysterious. It's not secret or especially private, but rather it's wide open. So let the air in. And the same goes for our Dharma teachers. Of course, we should respect the Buddha nature in all beings, including animals and bugs. And that's not my point. The Dharma is as precious as our attitude toward it. That's all that we know. In Dharma, we respect our teachers because only they have managed to get our attention, and only they can point out the methods for us to free ourselves from our own obscurations. The Dharma is sacred as a method only if and because it works for us, and not for any other reason. So as they say, don't gild the lily. The great Zen teacher Lin Chi once said, quote, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him," end quote. This doesn't refer to actually killing someone, but rather it recommends that we not worship, we not sacredize or idealize Buddhism, but rather just apply these Dharma techniques to working with our own life and self. Buddha is not suddenly going to appear and enlighten us. Waiting for that is mistaking the teachings. Our Buddha nature is already inside of us, waiting for us to become aware of it. And we can wait forever. And apparently, according to the Buddhist teachers, that's what we've done so up to this point in time. So, figuratively speaking, kill off that hope and that idealization in favor of actually enlightening yourself a day at a time. We can do this just through our own actions and practice. Don't expect it to somehow come down on us from above. But we could ask, what practice is appropriate for that? It's said that the wheel of the Dharma has to be turned. And there are many, many quotes in the text that Buddha turned the wheel of the Dharma, and so he did. But we have to as well. Turning the wheel of the Dharma for ourselves, for our own enlightenment, is our job. That wheel will just sit there and watch us stare at it. It will never turn by itself, not ever. We each have to turn the wheel of our own particular Dharma, because that's what the Buddha did for himself, and that's what he points out that we have to do. Dharma is very, very much a do-it-yourself project. As mentioned earlier, don't just place the Buddha on some high altar and then consider yourself as separate from him. Be bold. He was an ordinary human being, just as we are. His main teaching is that all sentient beings have Buddha nature, and that we each will have to, sooner or later, get around to enlightening ourselves and do just that. Treating the Buddhist practices as something beyond us, as something too holy, or in any way separate from our ordinary self is a costly mistake. Buddha nature is much closer than that. As the Dharma states, we each have to enlighten ourselves, warts and all, starting just where we are, just as we are now. So the advice is don't put off practicing Dharma because you feel obscured or because you feel that you're somehow unworthy in your own mind. Don't distance yourselves from your own practice by making it anything other than an integral part of your immediate world. In fact, the only requirement is that we learn how to practice. And that can be awkward at first, like any kind of practice. Here and now, that's when and where to practice. So, in summary, the Dharma is already a part of us, obscurations, warts, and all. So, let's not perfume the Dharma into something separate from us, from our particular situation. We're not an exception. In fact, there are no exceptions with the Dharma. We all need it, and we'll someday have to do it. No matter how stained or depressed we may feel, don't use that as an excuse to give up or to get down on ourselves. Just drop all that and start fresh in each instant. That's what basic meditation teaches us. No apologies to ourself are needed, and the self works for us and not vice versa. And the Buddhists very clearly say, don't waste time on trying to mess with your past. Just walk on. The Buddhist phrase is, quote, don't prolong the past, end quote. Instead, make a better past and a future in the present. That's what's suggested. The Dharma is perfectly at home even in the most nitty-gritty situations that we find ourselves, in those that we're most embarrassed by or ashamed of. It's very much a come-as-you-are Dharma. There's nothing holier than thou about Dharma techniques. They are perfect for, quote, thou, unquote, and they work just as we are, in whatever mess we happen to find ourselves. There's no one watching us other than our own self. And keep in mind, in the Buddhist view, the self is just our own dummy, and we are the ventriloquist. As the Beatles put it, no one will be watching us. Why don't we do it in the road? So unless you need them as a comfort blanket, I suggest put aside your lava lamps, candles, incense, and whatever for a spell. Don't create a mood. The Dharma is not mysterious. We don't have to set the scene in any way, but just start kind of right where we are and practice developing some awareness. And I repeat, it's adding insult to injury to be cowed by our own actions, even if they happened only a second ago. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it. Try not to do it again, and certainly just drop it. Move on. Don't waste time being ashamed or apologizing. Just begin again. Start over. Don't apologize to yourself, because the self is no one that you know and will never be.